I refer to the idea of afterlife in heaven versus hell as dichotomous afterlife. In my book I prove that this idea is irrational, such that there is no rational criterion, or set of criteria, that God could use to separate the set of all people into two categories, those who belong in heaven and those who belong in hell. I'll give you a feel for why this is true now, but you'll have to read my book to get the technical details of the proof. After explaining why the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational, I'll explain the historical origin of the idea. Suppose that we have a continuum ranging from pure white on your left to pure black on your right. It is irrational to draw a boundary line to separate white from black, because we lose the meaning of white versus black as we approach the boundary. The reason is that the difference in shade of white and black close to the boundary will become negligible as it goes to zero. In the figure, points A and D are readily distinguished from each other and are readily categorized as white and black respectively, because they are so far from the center. By contrast, points B and C are hard to distinguish because they are so close together. And if points B and C are moved closer together as the distance between them goes to zero, the ability to distinguish them will go to zero. From a different perspective, suppose that we are presented with such points individually and independent of the continuum. And suppose that we are asked to categorize them as white or black. The closer a point is to the boundary, the less consistent we will be in categorizing it as white or as black. I refer to this property of a continuum as boundary breakdown. I established this concept in Chapter 1 of my book. Then I use the concept throughout the book, but the most notable application is to prove that the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational. There are a number of continua that make the idea of dichotomous afterlife irrational, but the two most important are the virtue-vice continuum and the accountability continuum. The virtue-vice continuum ranges from a hypothetical notion of pure virtue at one end to a hypothetical notion of pure vice at the other end. In Christianity, the virtue end is attributed to Jesus, while the vice end is attributed to Satan. Notice that whether the extremes are identified with endpoints or are conceived to be open-ended doesn't matter with respect to the proof that the idea of dichotomous afterlife is irrational. Also keep in mind that we can conceive of the many ethical continua that there are in terms of a multidimensional space of continua. But again, this detail is irrelevant to the proof. So for simplicity, let's think in terms of a single ethical continuum ranging from pure virtue at one end to pure vice at the other end. Now the idea of dichotomous afterlife depends on the ability of God to partition the ethical continuum into two categories of virtue versus vice, such that people falling into the virtue category should be assigned to heaven, while people falling into the vice category should be assigned to hell. However, due to boundary breakdown, it's logically impossible for God to fulfill this task. For example, under the dichotomous afterlife model, say Hitler and Stalin should be sent to hell, and Francis of Assisi and Mother Teresa should be sent to heaven. But what about the rest of us? The behavior of most of us doesn't fall into the extremes. Most of us fall into the middle area of the continuum. More precisely, under the dichotomous afterlife model, every thought and every act must be categorized into one of the two categories. And this will be an impossible task due to boundary breakdown. There are variations on this basic scenario, but every variation is subject to boundary breakdown, and hence is irrational. That is, no matter what variation we concoct, we'll be faced with partitioning a continuum into two discrete categories, and due to boundary breakdown, there's no rational way to do this. Just as we can't rationally partition the white-black continuum into the two categories of white and black. One variation of the basic scenario occurs in Protestant Christianity, where the continuum applies to faith rather than to behavior. Under Protestantism, a person is assigned to heaven versus hell based on their beliefs about Jesus and their faith in those beliefs. So here we have boundary breakdown on a faith continuum instead of on a behavior continuum. Another continuum of interest is the accountability continuum. No one is going to say that a newborn baby can sin and thereby merit being sent to hell, but an adult can certainly sin and do horrible evil. This defines the accountability continuum, which ranges from the lack of accountability of a newborn to the accountability of a normal adult. The idea of a dichotomous afterlife requires, for every person, we partition this continuum into two categories: not accountable on the one hand and accountable on the other hand. But any such partition will be irrational due to boundary breakdown. If you're familiar with Christian theology, you realize that there are many theoretical problems with the idea of dichotomous afterlife, problems which people have been debating throughout the history of Christianity. To illustrate, here is one problem. How can God justify sending people to hell who never hear the gospel? Here's another problem. How can God justify sending people to hell who heard the gospel from people whose lives destroyed the effectiveness of the message? Now, the continuum problem applies to the idea of dichotomous afterlife in every religion that has such a notion. This includes the members of the Near Eastern monotheist family, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it applies to the relevant sects of Buddhism, Hinduism, and other religions. So we're bound to ask how devotees of these religions and sects respond to the continuum problem when they recognize it intuitively or when they are confronted with it explicitly. I'm familiar with Christians, and the Christian response will no doubt generalize to the other religions. I think that the most common response to the problem is to say that although we can't solve the problem, God can. However, I've proven that, in fact, God can't solve the problem, because it's logically impossible to solve the problem due to boundary breakdown.